Some people wake up in the morning and, almost without realizing it, begin thinking about everything that could go wrong. If the sky is clear, they wonder when the rain will come. If things are going well, they wait for something to disturb the peace. If an opportunity appears, they don't first see what might be possible. They see all the reasons it might not work. They call it being careful, being realistic, being experienced. Rachel used to think that way too, until one morning, on a piece of land she had walked across thousands of times, a man handed her a small magnifying glass, and for the first time in years, Rachel began to wonder if the problem wasn't only what life had been bringing her, maybe it was also what she had trained herself to look for. Rachel was 43 years old. She owned a modest family farm just outside a small town, where narrow roads ran between open fields and low rows of trees stretched toward the horizon. The farm wasn't large, but it had been in Rachel's family for 2 generations. Her father had grown vegetables there. Her mother had spent countless evenings at the old wooden table in the barn, recording expenses by hand in a little notebook. And when Rachel eventually took over the farm, she believed she knew that land almost as well as she knew her own hand. She knew which fields held water best. She knew which rows caught the first morning light. She knew which pump made a faint rattling sound before something went wrong. Sometimes, just by looking at the sky late in the afternoon, she could tell how cold the night was going to be. Rachel was a good farmer, hardworking, disciplined, practical, but there was something she hadn't noticed about herself. After years of unpredictable seasons, she had become so good at preparing for bad things that she had slowly forgotten how to expect good ones. Rachel usually woke up at 5:15 every morning. She didn't need an alarm anymore. Her body had learned the schedule years ago. She would make a pot of coffee, pull on the old jacket that hung beside the kitchen door, and head outside while the sky was still dim. Mornings on the farm were quiet. There was the sound of the barn door sliding open, her boots crossing the gravel, the engine of her old pickup turning over after a long night. That used to be Rachel's favorite part of the day. But over the last few years, those mornings had changed. She still looked across the fields. She just didn't look at them the same way anymore. If she saw clouds in the distance, she thought about heavy rain. If the sky was too clear, she thought about drought. If the plants were growing well, she checked more closely for pests. If a piece of equipment was running smoothly, she started calculating how old it was and how much longer it might last. Nobody thought of Rachel as a negative person. She rarely complained. She didn't walk around telling everyone that things were going badly. She simply prepared for everything all the time, and she believed that was what responsible people did. Maybe that habit had begun 3 years earlier. That summer, a stretch of extreme heat arrived just when the crops needed water most. Then one of the pumps failed. Input costs rose soon after. By the end of the season, Rachel had made enough to keep the farm going, but far less than she had expected. The following year was better, but a section on the south side of the farm began producing poorly. Rachel tried a different variety. She adjusted the irrigation schedule. She added organic matter to the soil. Nothing made enough of a difference. By the 3rd season, she had almost stopped expecting anything from that field. She still planted it, still maintained it, still did what needed to be done. But somewhere in Rachel's mind, the south field had become the place where things simply didn't work. One cold afternoon near the end of March, Rachel stood beside her pickup looking across that piece of land. Ben, who helped manage supplies and equipment on the farm, stood beside her. "What are we doing with the south field this year?" Rachel pulled her jacket tighter against the wind. "Same as last year." Ben looked at her. "What if we take another look at the irrigation?" Rachel shook her head. "We've already tried that. Maybe this time." "Ben." Her voice wasn't harsh. It was simply the voice of someone who had already made up her mind. "Let's not put any more money into it." Ben nodded and headed back toward the barn. Rachel stayed where she was for another moment. She looked at the field, then she turned away. 2 weeks later, Ben left a business card on Rachel's desk. Daniel Foster, agricultural engineer. He had worked with several farms in the region, mostly evaluating soil conditions, irrigation systems, and crop layout. Rachel picked up the card. "Do we really need another person coming out here to tell us what we already know?" Ben smiled. "Maybe he'll tell us something we don't." Rachel almost handed the card back. Instead, she set it down on the desk. 3 days later, Daniel arrived. He was in his late 30s and drove a dust-covered truck. He wore jeans, work boots, and carried a black field bag. Rachel liked that. At least he hadn't shown up in spotless shoes to explain farming to her. They went straight to the south field. As they walked, Rachel pointed things out. "Last year we barely got anything from this section." She pointed to the right. "That side dries out too fast." A few steps later, she stopped again. "We changed varieties here." Daniel crouched and picked up some soil. "We changed the watering schedule too." He rubbed the soil between his fingers. "We've added organic matter twice." Daniel still said nothing. Rachel finally grew impatient. "Are you hearing me?" He looked up. "Yes." "So what do you think?" Daniel looked around. "I don't know yet." Rachel folded her arms. He smiled. "I've been here 10 minutes." Rachel laughed despite herself. They spent almost 2 hours in the field. Daniel checked several areas. He asked about watering schedules, rainfall, previous crops, which sections dried first. Rachel answered every question, but somewhere along the way, she noticed something strange. Almost everything she told him was about something that had gone wrong. Eventually, Daniel stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "There are some problems here." Rachel nodded, as though she'd just been proven right. "I know, but there's also quite a bit that's working." Rachel looked at him. "Here." Daniel pointed toward the ground. "The root systems in several sections are still pretty healthy. The slope is better than I expected, and the upper part of the field is holding more moisture than you described." Rachel frowned slightly. Daniel looked across the rows. "There's more working here than you think." Rachel didn't answer. There was nothing profound about the sentence. It wasn't even advice. Still, something about it bothered her. Daniel had spent 2 hours looking at the same field Rachel had been looking at for 3 years. He saw the problems, but somehow, he had also seen something else. Daniel suggested they leave most of the field alone and create one small test plot. They would adjust the irrigation, add organic matter in stages, change the spacing between plants, monitor moisture more carefully. Rachel studied the numbers he'd written in his notebook. "And if it doesn't work?" Daniel capped his pen. Then we'll know one more thing that doesn't work. Rachel laughed. Are you always this optimistic? No. He looked back toward the field. I just like having the data before I decide something can't work. In the end, Rachel agreed, mostly because the test plot was small enough that if it failed, they wouldn't lose much. Over the next few weeks, Daniel came back several times. Rachel continued with her usual routine. Every morning, she checked the test plot. On the first day, she looked for weak plants. A few days later, she checked whether the soil was drying too quickly. A week in, she noticed several leaves changing color and immediately took pictures and sent them to Daniel. His reply came a few minutes later. I see it. I'll check tomorrow. Rachel stared at her phone. She almost typed, I told you so, but she didn't. Daniel arrived the next morning. He examined the leaves Rachel had photographed, then checked several other plants. He told her it was most likely a temporary response to the irrigation chain. Nothing serious. Rachel wasn't convinced. You're sure? Pretty sure. Pretty sure isn't sure. Daniel looked at her and smiled. Rachel, how many things in farming are you 100% sure about? She didn't have an answer. A heavy rain came that weekend. Rachel woke sometime after 2 in the morning to the sound of water beating against her bedroom window. She lay there staring at the ceiling. Almost immediately, images began forming in her mind. Soil washing away, roots sitting in too much water, the new test plot being damaged before they'd had a chance to learn anything from it. Eventually, Rachel turned on the light, pulled on her jacket, and went outside. She didn't come back in until nearly 3. Nothing serious had happened. The next morning, Ben noticed her mud-covered boots by the door. You went out in the middle of the night again. Rachel poured herself some coffee. Just checking. Ben didn't say anything, but Rachel recognized the look on his face. Her father had given her that look before. Her former husband had too. It was the kind of look that seemed to ask, Rachel, are you taking care of the farm, or are you letting the farm take every bit of peace you have? She didn't want to think about it. There was work to do. About 3 weeks after they started the test plot, Rachel headed toward the south field early one morning. Daniel was already there. He was kneeling between 2 rows. Rachel quickened her pace. What's wrong? Daniel turned around. Good morning. Is there a problem? No. Rachel kept walking toward him. Then what are you looking at? Instead of answering, Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small magnifying glass with a black handle. He held it out to her. Look at this. Rachel took it. At what? Daniel pointed toward a young leaf close to the base of one of the plants. Look closer. Rachel crouched and brought the magnifying glass down. There, between 2 small leaves, was a new shoot. Tiny, pale green, easy to miss if you were simply walking past. New growth, Rachel said. Daniel nodded. Not just this one. He pointed toward several plants nearby. Rachel moved down the row. One plant, then another, then another. Not everything was perfect. Some plants were still weaker than the others. A few leaves still needed watching, but the test plot was responding. Rachel stood up and looked across the rows. Then she looked at the magnifying glass in her hand. Daniel glanced at her. You know what's interesting? Rachel waited. For the last 3 weeks, every time you've called me, You found a problem before I did. Rachel smiled. Is that supposed to be a compliment? Partly. And the other part, Daniel pointed toward the new growth. These have been here for several days. Rachel went quiet. You didn't see them. Her first instinct was to argue, but she knew he was right. It wasn't that Rachel hadn't been paying attention. She had been paying very close attention, but every time she walked into that field, she had been looking for one thing. What's wrong? She looked for yellow leaves, dry soil, insects, signs that something was failing. And because she was always looking for those things, she usually found them. Daniel moved toward another row. Rachel stayed where she was. She looked down at the magnifying glass, then at the tiny shoot again. There was no dramatic revelation, no sudden feeling that her life had changed. Only one small thought. Maybe I've become too good at finding what's wrong. The next morning, Rachel returned to the field, out of habit. She stopped beside a plant with two slightly pale leaves. She bent down. Then she remembered the magnifying glass Daniel had left with her. Rachel straightened and looked at the plant beside it. New growth. She checked another. The roots seemed stronger, a little farther down the row. The section that usually dried first was still holding moisture. Rachel pulled the small notebook from her pocket. Most pages were filled with notes like check leaves, low moisture, adjust irrigation. That morning, beneath those familiar lines, Rachel wrote something else. New growth, row 4. She looked at the words for a moment, then closed the notebook. Nothing remarkable happened that day, but the next morning, she did it again, and the morning after that, she still recorded the problems that needed attention. She simply began recording what was working too, not because she wanted to fool herself, not because she was pretending the farm didn't have problems. She just wanted to see the whole picture. About a month later, a farmer named George, who owned a place a few miles down the road, stopped by. He had an idea. There was a piece of equipment they both needed, but neither of them used it for more than a few weeks each year. Maybe, he suggested, they could buy one together. A few months earlier, Rachel's mind would have immediately filled with questions. What if it breaks? What if we both need it at the same time? What if we disagree about repairs? Those questions still came, but this time, Rachel didn't let them end the conversation. She pulled out the chair across from her desk. Sit down. Tell me what you're thinking. They didn't make a decision that day, but Rachel listened. Another afternoon, her daughter Sophie called. Mom, are you busy Saturday? Rachel looked out the window. Saturday was always busy. Every day on a farm was busy. Why? I was thinking about driving up. Could we go to lunch? Rachel almost gave her usual answer. Let me see. But then she looked at the notebook on her desk. The important work was scheduled. Ben would be there. The weather forecast looked steady. Sure, Rachel said. There was a pause. Really? Rachel laughed. Don't act like I've never gone to lunch before. I'm just enjoying the moment. That Saturday, Rachel was away from the farm for more than 3 hours. Nothing broke. No emergency call came. Nothing terrible happened because she'd spent a little longer with her daughter than she'd planned. Driving home, Rachel realized how many years she had spent preparing for things that might happen, while sometimes saying no to good things that were already happening. Summer arrived. The test plot did not become a miracle story. Some plants still underperformed. they still had adjustments to make. 1 week of intense heat forced Rachel and Daniel to change the watering schedule again, but overall, the results were good enough for Daniel to recommend expanding the trial the following season. One afternoon, they stood at the edge of the south field. Daniel studied the numbers on his tablet. Not bad. Rachel looked at him. That's all. What do you want me to say? After all that work, I think we deserve at least a great. Daniel smiled. All right, great. Rachel laughed. A year earlier, she had believed that field wasn't worth trying anymore. Now it still wasn't perfect, but it had potential. And perhaps what surprised Rachel most was that the potential had been there before she was able to see it. At the end of the season, Daniel came by to collect a final set of soil samples. As he was getting ready to leave, Rachel called after him. Daniel. He turned. She held up the small magnifying glass. You left this here a long time ago. Daniel looked at it. No, I knew where it was. Rachel walked toward him and held it out. I already have a magnifying glass. I know. Daniel opened the door of his truck. Then he glanced toward the field. Keep it. You seem to be looking for different things these days. Rachel looked at him. Daniel didn't explain. He got into his truck and drove away. Rachel stood beside the barn with the magnifying glass resting in her palm. She turned toward the south field. There were still things that needed work. A section of irrigation line needed checking. Some rows were uneven. Weeds were starting to appear near the far corner. Rachel saw all of it, but it wasn't all she saw anymore. She saw stronger plants, new growth, and a piece of land she had once written off, preparing for another season. For the first time in a long time, when Rachel thought about what might happen next, she didn't ask what could go wrong. She wondered, what good thing might happen? Maybe a lucky mindset isn't believing that everything will always work out exactly the way we want. Rachel was still a farmer. She knew better than most that some things simply couldn't be controlled. Rain could come too late. Equipment could fail. A good plan could still produce a disappointing result. But preparing for difficulty and living as though difficulty is always on its way are not the same thing. Rachel didn't suddenly become the luckiest person in the world. Her life didn't magically change after one growing season. What changed was much quieter. She began allowing herself to notice possibility again. Sometimes the good things in life don't arrive with much noise. Sometimes they're more like a tiny green shoot in a field you've already decided isn't doing well. They may already be there. We just have to be willing to notice them. The next morning, Rachel woke at 5:15. Just as she always did, she made her coffee, pulled on her old jacket, and stepped outside as the first light appeared beyond the rows of trees. Daniel's little magnifying glass was still in her pocket. As Rachel passed the south field, she stopped beside one of the rows. She bent down, not because she'd spotted a problem, but because a tiny new shoot had opened overnight. Rachel smiled. Then she stood and continued walking. The day hadn't really begun yet. She had no idea what it would bring. And for once, she didn't need to know. She had simply learned to leave a little room for something good. Thank you for spending these quiet moments with Rachel and the peaceful chapter. If her story reminded you of something good in your own life that you may have overlooked, perhaps tomorrow you can give it another look. And if you enjoy gentle stories like this, Please subscribe to support the peaceful chapter and make sure you don't miss the stories and videos still to come. Until next time, take good care of yourself.